Hello. We want to finish up our discussion of the 1912 presidential election. I think it's clear by now that the Republican Party certainly is in a great deal of trouble. As a result of the schism, the absolute split between the progressive wing of the Republican Party and the old guard or business wing of the Progressive Party, that the Republican Party is going to have a very difficult chance in retaining the presidency in 1912. As I indicated, in fact, that you have a third-party candidate. Roosevelt felt he had been cheated out of the Republican nomination. And in fact, there is evidence to support the fact that indeed those 250 contested delegates seats that we talked about should have gone rightfully to Theodore Roosevelt. But Taft retained and controlled the party machinery, and that included the Credentials Committee. And as a result of that, Taft was able to get those 250 contested seats and the Republican nomination. So outraged was Roosevelt that he agreed to accept a third-party candidacy. And as we pointed out during the election, Taft did very little campaigning. In some ways, one wonders if Taft simply hadn't conceded defeat. Now you have a split Republican Party on the one hand, and you have for the first time in years a united Democratic Party. United under the standard bearer of Woodrow Wilson, who was, quite frankly, who became a political star overnight. A part of it, I think, had less to do with Wilson's known or experience, because he had only been governor for 2 years. I mean, didn't have very much political experience at all. I think Wilson's rise to such prominence, certainly as a presidential candidate, had to do with the fact that the Democrats wanted simply to win the presidency. They simply were tired of being defeated by the Republicans. So you have this contest in 1912, which is essentially a campaign between Roosevelt, who was the Progressive Party candidate, Wilson, who was a Democratic Party candidate, Taft, the Republican Party candidate, and Eugene Debs, the Socialist Party candidate. We talked about their two philosophies, Roosevelt and Wilson, the New Nationalism and the New Freedom. Quite frankly, if we look at the New Freedom, in many ways it looks as though it could have been a platform for a conservative Republican. In fact, if we look at Roosevelt's New Nationalism, as we did, it looks as if he was certainly more of a Democratic candidate than Wilson. In fact, Wilson was so confused. Wilson was concerned after he looked at his platform, after he went over his New Freedom, he was in fact not sure he indeed was a progressive. Wilson had always thought he was a progressive, but he had reservations about his own political platform. Indeed, it took Louis Brandeis, the lawyer whom we had talked about, it took him to convince Wilson that in spite of what he felt, he was a true progressive. And his New Freedom was a progressive party, was a progressive platform, even though it was a Democratic Party. Remember, as I indicated at the outset, there were progressives both within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party. But this was a progressivism that was very different than Roosevelt's. The idea that the president does not get involved in initiating legislation. Wilson's New Freedom. That the president doesn't support social justice legislation. All that does is to make the American population a welfare state, or is very paternalistic. The only thing that really seemed to be strictly a Democratic platform or point of a platform was his stance on big business. Wilson truly wanted to break up large businesses. I mean, he was clearly, in philosophy, a trust buster. Wilson believed if you broke up the large trust, you wouldn't need regulation. And that is what Roosevelt had always said. Roosevelt understood the abuses of big business. But Roosevelt was not impractical. He understood two things, and as some of you have emailed me and we've talked about, that Roosevelt understood that one, that America and the world was evolving in such a way that really large and medium-sized businesses could not meet the need now of a national and what was now moving very much into an international economy and market. That small businesses couldn't simply address those needs. So, even though there were evils, they were needed. And it was impractical to think that you could do without them. Big businesses. Plus, if you had gotten rid of big businesses, in all likelihood, they would have returned. Again, because of the era, because of the time. So Roosevelt was content to simply argue for the regulation of big business. To get big business to discontinue some of their most flagrant abuses. But he understood. In fact, if you look at, as we talked about, Roosevelt's whole new nationalism, it seems very much in tune with the modern era that America was evolving into. That there were some things the states could not handle themselves. That there were some things that simply government was only big enough to do. The evolution of big government is in part a result of the evolution of America as an urban society, where states, in many instances, were not able to handle or meet the needs, particularly in interstate commerce and things like that. So, in some ways, I think Wilson's platform was less realistic. In 1912, it is unlikely, as America was moving clearly and had moved away from a predominantly agrarian society, that we were going to restore, as Wilson argued, Jeffersonian individualism. We were not going back to an agrarian society of small farmers. How nostalgic that may have sounded and how idealistic, but it was not likely to happen. Nor was it likely that many Americans now who did not live on the farms, who lived in these big impersonal cities, would be able to handle problems by themselves. They now needed, obviously, the intervention of government in certain aspects of their lives. Well, he may have had the least practical program, but it is Wilson who will win the election. And he will win the election in spite of the fact that Roosevelt is still the most popular president in American history to that date. That Roosevelt will win 27% of the popular vote, but he will lose the election because of the Republican Party split. In spite of the fact that people really loved Roosevelt in some ways, third-party candidates, no matter even if it is a Roosevelt, is likely to win a national presidential election. For several reasons, there is a kind of natural inertia. America has evolved as a two-party system. There is a kind of reluctance to break with tradition. I mean, we may champion a third-party candidate, but when we step inside the voting booth, we begin to ask some very practical questions. One is party loyalty. Even though I like this candidate, I am still what? I am still a Republican, or I am still a Democrat. It is hard to say I am an independent. It's hard to get that out. So you stick with what you know in spite of the candidate. At the last minute, you probably don't vote for the independent candidate. And then you become even more practical. You ask yourself, well, in the first place, this is if I vote for this independent, this third-party candidate, it's a waste of my vote. Because he's not going to win. Third parties don't win. So therefore, why should I waste a vote? And so you wind up voting for your own party. But enough people do vote a third party to sometimes hurt the incumbent party. In this case, it split the Republican Party and it took away from the base. And therefore, Wilson was able to win. Had there been a unified Republican Party, had there not been a progressive party, Roosevelt would have won, I think, the election. That is what people fear about third-party candidacies and third parties today. It is not that the third party, the so-called Reform Party we hear about today, will ever win the presidential election. People are terribly afraid of what it will do, what it will take from what? The two established parties. Which one will it hurt the most? That is really what it comes down to. Well, Wilson wins the election. He takes a vacation. He goes to Bermuda to rest and relax. He has a friend virtually name his entire cabinet for him, a man by the name of Colonel Edward House. We'll talk more about him later on, but not right now, during World War I. But Colonel Edward House, he will virtually put together Wilson's cabinet. There are several, I think, observations that we can make about Wilson's cabinet and Wilson's election. One is that it is a shift in geographical power in the White House. Wilson is a Southerner, and the overwhelming majority of his cabinet members are Southerners. So you have a geographical shift in power in the executive branch of the government. Okay? And secondly, as we will see later, that will have consequences when we look at race relations a little bit later. Well, Wilson returns, And while Wilson does not have the same kind of personality as a Theodore Roosevelt, Wilson is an extremely capable politician. Anyone who would underestimate Wilson because of his educational background and simply dismiss him as a school teacher is in for a surprise. And Wilson, during his first term, is successful. And I'm going to give Wilson, to some extent today, short shrifts so we can begin to look at foreign policy. I do want to look at several of Wilson's first administration achievements. First, the Underwood Tariff. One of Wilson's platform objectives, goals, as a Democrat was to lower the tariff. Okay, was to lower the tariff. This is always an historical objective of the Democratic Party. It has always championed a lower tariff, believing that overseas competition would lower prices. It would force American corporations, often located in the Northeast, and not favorable to farmers and agrarian people, to lower their prices. But again, we know how difficult it is to get a tariff really lowered. The progressives tried it in the Payne-Aldrich tariff, and essentially it failed. The tariff, after all the sound and thunder, the tariff structure remained the same. But Wilson is committed. Wilson, again, through the House, is able to come up with a version of the tariff, the so-called Underwood Tariff, which is a significant reduction across the board of tariff duties in America. In fact, if the bill passed, it would lower the average tariff on goods about 29%. A significant reduction. 29%. 29%. Which is significant. But the Republicans make it very clear that they're not. Once it gets past the House and into the Senate, I should point out that, again, the Democrats are successful in the midterm elections and in 1912 of taking control of Congress. So, which makes it easier for Wilson to get many of his bills passed. There's a whole reaction against the Republican Party because of the infighting. Wilson gets the bill passed in the House and it goes to the Senate. There the Senate will balk. There they will be reluctant to pass on the Underwood Tariff. As I indicated earlier, senators generally tend to be more conservative when it comes to passing certain bills. And in this case, and the reason I pointed out was that senators serve for 6 years. They are virtually almost always wealthy. And in this particular instance, rumors were circulated that many of the Republicans opposed the tariff because many of these tariffs would directly affect their profits, particularly those who owned shares or owned parts in the sugar industry, the sugar lobby in America. In fact, where did this come from? These rumors. Well, it came from Wilson. Wilson said the reason that the tariff is being held up is that there are people in the Senate who benefit directly from a high protective tariff and who are not concerned about the American people, but concerned about lining, in a sense, their own pockets. Well, whoa! Was this outburst on Wilson's part an example of his inexperience as a political novice? I mean, in law they tell you, never ask a question or make a statement that you can't answer. It can be embarrassing in the end. And so the Republicans said, you know what, I think we're going to teach Woodrow a lesson right off the bat. We're going to hold our own investigation to see, in fact, if anyone here benefits from a high protective tariff. We're going to embarrass Wilson. I don't know what the Republicans were thinking about. I mean, halfway through the investigation, it was embarrassing. Half the Republicans had benefited from the tariff directly. They had stock in these companies. And particularly the sugar people. I mean, it was so embarrassing that they had to drop their opposition to the tariff altogether. And like Roosevelt, Wilson doesn't mind the political infighting. They dropped the fight and the Underwood Tariff is passed. Now, there is a significant, obviously when you reduce the tariff structure about 29%, and you have to do two things. One, you have to include a long list of duty-free goods, okay, to get it passed, and they did that politically. But how do you make up for the lost revenue, federal revenue, from customs collection? Well, it is because of this that we have the Underwood Tariff, the passage of the first federal income tax. Okay? This is where we have the passage of the first federal income tax. Although it didn't really hurt Americans very much, it started out fairly insignificant. I'm not sure we'd say that now, especially at this time of the year. But you do have the Underwood Tariff passed. Again, an example of Wilson's skill. But Wilson isn't finished. Almost in his first year, he will get most of these things passed, like Roosevelt did in 1903. He moves from that to a second promise that he made as a presidential candidate. And this second promise was that he was going to somehow change the banking system. But once again, that's typical of a Democrat. Democrats, as far back as one can remember, have opposed the banking system in America. Farmers who tended to become most of the Democrats accused the national banking system, headquartered in New York, as biased against the farmers. That the banking practices favored large businesses and discriminated against farmers and agrarian interests. In fact, by 1900, it was common to hear Democrats talk about the Wall Street conspiracy, the Eastern money conspiracy, lobby. And indeed, I think it's true that prior to Wilson's Glass Act that we're going to talk about, I think it's clear that the National Bank supported the interest of big business. When it came to loans, they supported big business. Well, by 1912, there were a lot of people who were ready now for some revision in the banking system, some control over the banking system, which seemed to be simply concentrated in the East. A bill comes before Wilson that proposes to decentralize the federal banking system. To decentralize the federal banking system. To get away from having simply one bank located in New York somewhere, they wanted the establishment of a decentralized banking system around the country. Not only would they have a decentralized banking system, but one which would be supervised by a national board. So what do we have then? We have what we have today. We have the passage. Here again, it was opposed strenuously by Republicans, but Wilson had the votes, and indeed, Wilson was going to keep them there until it was almost Christmas. And he gave orders to the party that they were not to go home and put up the stockings until this bill was passed. And I think it was maybe 2 days before. And they had to get out. And they passed the Glass Act, which is the establishment, which is probably Wilson's greatest legacy. Because it is still with us today. It is the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. The Glass Act is the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. 12 banks, regionally located throughout the country, subject to the regulation and supervision of the National Reserve Board. This decentralized banking system, regionally located, should represent the interests of the various regions in the country. That was a great part of the philosophy behind having banks located in different parts of the country. A decentralized banking system, 12 Federal Reserve banks with a National Federal Reserve Board to supervise. Today we still have the Federal Reserve System. Today it is still one of the most powerful institutions in America in terms of the American economy. The head of the Federal Reserve Board is one of the most powerful men in America. Some people think that the head of the Federal Reserve Board may be as powerful sometimes as the president because they set interest rates at which banks can loan money. It affects everything from your car interest rate to your house interest rate. They can speed up an economy or they can slow one down. It's a powerful institution. Wilson gets this passed. Obviously, it's stronger today than it was in 1913, but this is where it comes from. Wilson is successful. Two of his major points, the most important points, he's already gotten passed. And then there's an act that is, I think, somewhat, a little bit out of character with Wilson's new freedom, in a way. Again, he was not interested much in supporting special interests. Remember, it didn't matter what the special interest was. He didn't believe in special interests. special interests interfered with competition. America could not grow unless it had pure, unfettered competition. Monopolies interfered with competition. Unions interfered with competition. Because all these were examples of special interest groups wanting something for themselves. So, the Clayton Act, which Wilson pushes through, is an act that will benefit unions. In fact, unions will hail, I think prematurely, certainly, will hail the Clayton Act. The Clayton Act as labor's Magna Carta. Labor's Magna Carta. That's an awfully big order, tall order. And it doesn't really do that at all. What it does, though, perhaps it's significant. We will look at the real significant act on behalf of labor during the New Deal, the Wagner Act. But this act is a precursor to what will come in the Wagner Act. It does not recognize unions. It simply will state that unions are no longer simply to be considered commodities. And while it states in principle that unions are no longer to be considered simply commodities, it will also provide limitations on the use of federal injunctions to break up strikes. Because what had happened in the past was that federal judges, often supported by Republican business interests, would issue one federal injunction after another to make sure that unions could not strike. The Clayton Act will now severely limit the ability of federal judges to issue indiscriminate injunctions against unions in strikes, even though unions are not recognized, nor is collective bargaining. Well, they're not officially recognized, but it does give them what? Some hope for the future. And certainly the limitations on the federal judges is important. Wilson had a host of other bills that he was going to pass during his first administration. But Wilson's domestic program will suddenly take a back seat to events that are transpiring in Europe. In other words, what happens in 1914 is that with the beginning of World War I, Wilson's energies now must be turned away from domestic policy, and he becomes absorbed now with preparing the country for war. So, let's leave Wilson's domestic policy, and let's now go back and look at foreign policy at the turn of the century. Let's look at factors that would influence American foreign policy at the turn of the century. One, the need for surplus markets. By 1900, America had grown dramatically economically. phenomenal growth. What do you do now when your economy is so hot and you have so many products and that your own country cannot absorb them? You must find what? An outlet for these surplus goods. Americans now begin to look overseas as a place to sell their surplus products. So, any consideration of foreign policy will take into account the need to protect America's business interests and markets overseas. We can see this from 1877 to 1900. We can see America moving slowly at first. Not quite. We can see it taking steps as it moves toward a policy that was definitely to protect American business interests from 1877. Americans are not always aware of it. It is not a clear-cut foreign policy. There is no clear-cut foreign policy in 1877. But we can see with two treaties, one with Samoa, and almost a war with Germany over Samoa, that the Americans understand the need to protect their growing overseas markets. Because let me point out that it's not just America. Other foreign countries now are staking out markets overseas. If America is to be competitive, it must also compete. Indeed, in 1878, America will make a treaty with Samoa in which the Americans, in exchange for, and this becomes important, because we'll talk about this in a moment, in exchange for a place for American ships to refuel, called coaling or refueling stations, they will agree to adjust any differences between Samoa and any other foreign country. Well, the Americans thought it was clever that they had gotten the Samoan prince to accept this 1878 treaty, because they would now get these coaling stations in which American ships, both maritime and military ships, and it's important to be able to stop there, refuel, and go on, because of the great distance from America. But what happens is that the Samoan prince knew exactly what he was doing. So-called tattooed prince of Samoa. They wanted a country who was strong enough to keep the Germans, the French, and the British, who all wanted coaling stations too, in Samoa. And they were always creating and fomenting trouble in Samoa, especially the Germans. During the 1870s and 1880s, the Germans are always somewhere, it seems, causing trouble. By 1883, the Americans and the Germans have almost gone to war over Samoa, because the Germans will attack the Samoans, and a few Samoans are killed, and the U.S. has to intervene according to the Treaty of 1878. And here you have, in 1883, the Americans and Samoans, the Americans and the Germans, just about ready to have a shooting war at a place called Apia, A-P-I-A, off the coast of the Samoan Islands. And the only thing that stops a shooting war from erupting is that, and I'm not making this up, that a great storm arose and virtually sunk both the American and German fleet. And the British, who had been watching all this, they're always somewhere too, but they were out of harm's way. They sailed in and saved both fleets. But the fact that America was even willing to enter a treaty with Samoa indicated that they understood. Perhaps they didn't want to articulate it, but they understood that they had to have a foreign policy that was not what isolationists, because their interests were different. Which brings up the teachings of Alfred T. Mahan. This is a part of this whole thing. The teachings of Alfred T. Mahan. Mahan was a military strategist. And Mahan wrote a number of books which by the 1880s Congress was really fascinated with, and he was extremely influential among a number of congressmen. His book, The History of Sea Power in the World, made it very clear that if America was ever to achieve the status of Great Britain as a world power, it would have to achieve two things. One, it would have to create a powerful navy, because it is the country that controls the seas that will be successful in creating itself as a world power. The history, he cited the history of England, that England's great navy was responsible for England's greatness as a world power. And America, in a sense, had to imitate that example. As a result of that, Congress will rush for the first time, and it certainly needed it, will rush to now to invent a modern navy. In the 1880s and 1890s, you have Congress making several appropriations to build modern, steel-hulled, big battleships. I mean, in 1877, one admiral said that the American fleet was so pitiful that it couldn't beat anybody if a war ever broke out. That in fact, the Americans would be better off imitating the example of the old Chinese and paint dragons on their sails to scare away the enemies. That's about how formidable the American Navy was in the late 1870s. But this will change. This will change in great part because of Alfred T. Mahan's teachings and his influence. You begin to have the beginning of a modern navy. Yes?
And what year was it that the Congress rushed to invent the modern navy?
In 1883, you have one appropriations bill. You have several. In the 1890s, you have another bill. But the Navy, what you really have, what you start to see now, are one bill after another that's passed periodically by Congress to increase the size of the Navy. Particularly as we get toward the end of the century, where foreign policy becomes clearer and purpose becomes what? Clearer. Certainly after the Spanish-American War, we see an even accelerated program. And that comes as a realization that the rest of the world, too, is expanding their navy and their military armaments. Actually, what we will see is the beginning of an arms race that will be one of the reasons for World War I that Wilson is very much aware of. But, let me hold us back here for a minute. Now, the second point, if you have a navy, both military and maritime, you have to have a place to do what? For them to refuel. So he was very much in favor of Americans pursuing a foreign policy that would acquire in some way or some fashion overseas possessions, either through annexation or through some sort of a treaty. But some way the U.S. had to have what? Had to have agreements, had to have places for their ships, both military and maritime, to be able to refuel and their men to be able to relax and prepare. Here again, what is another example of this? Will be the American treaty with, the American participation in Hawaii. Eventually, America will annex Hawaii because of its strategic location, its strategic position as a coaling station. In fact, about the same time that you have the Samoan Treaty, you have a treaty with Hawaii, which is even clearer in 1878, which is even clearer than the one with Samoa. In this one, the U.S. will sign this treaty with Hawaii, which will tell the Hawaiians that in exchange for a lowering of the tariff duties on sugar. Now, at this point in the late 1870s, the Hawaiian sugar growers were in an economic depression. Their prices were very depressed. They were suffering, partly because the U.S. sugar tariffs were so high. But the U.S. government promised that with Hawaii, they would lower the sugar barriers to allow the sugar growers, who happened to be people of American descent, who first came to Hawaii in the 1820s, actually. This is an interesting story about that. I want to get into it, but they were the sons of missionaries who came to save souls, but wound up owning these great plantations. In fact, by 1891, 2/3 of all the taxable real estate in Hawaii was owned by people of American descent and some British. Well, we don't want to get into that because we had to go back to the Hawaiian Revolution. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the treaty, the U.S. would lower the duty on sugar. Okay? In exchange, Hawaii would give the Americans access to a coaling station, to a refueling station, and would not allow any foreign country, this was spelled out, that the Hawaiians would not allow any foreign countries to set up lodgment on the islands. I mean, this is a clear statement of a country acting in its own interest. Certainly not a country that has been historically an isolationist country. That it is telling Hawaii that in exchange for our dropping the sugar, which will really create a boom economic for the Hawaiians, by the way. I mean, this is important because Hawaiian sugar growers will now experience a period of unprecedented prosperity as a result of this treaty. But in exchange, the Hawaiians cannot allow any other foreign country, to get away from what happened in Samoa, any other foreign country to set up lodgment in Hawaii. Hands off. it is very clear about their own interests, and that the U.S. would have their own coaling and refueling station there. So Mahan, these are all largely influenced by Mahan. You have to have overseas coaling stations. This is really if we think about the Spanish-American War, in fact, and the disposition of the Philippines, nowhere can we see these factors coming together. All of these factors influencing American foreign policy. American nationalism. The need for surplus markets. The teachings of A.T. Mahan. And even, as we will, I'm going to discuss all these and show you the examples of them, and even the new, so-called new imperialism, I'm going to shift these back around, were all in evidence in America's entering the war against Spain and the annexation of the Philippines. Partly, the reason America gets involved in the war is an incredible upsurge in the late 1880s of American nationalism, fueled by the Industrial Revolution. Here we have a country now that is growing by leaps and bounds. It is a country that is proud of itself. It is a country that is brimming with energy. One scholar has put it that in 1895, when the Cuban Revolution breaks out, which will precipitate America's entry into the war with Spain, that America had reached the point where it needed to expand or burst. It was experiencing this new nationalism, which was now expressed in a new manifest destiny. The first manifest destiny had been to expand from the east to the west coast. Now with this tremendous energy created by this economic, the Industrial Revolution, the Americans now had a new manifest destiny now to expand their influence internationally. Scholars have argued that they felt as though they would expand or burst. And they did not take kindly to insults from any country. Americans were very patriotic in the 1880s, 1890s, and all the way to the turn of the century. An upsurge in kind of jingoism. You didn't say anything negative about America unless you wanted the Americans to respond. The U.S. would respond immediately. American people seem to be more patriotic. They sing patriotic songs at operas now for the first time, at sports events, the national anthem, all these things personified a country that was experiencing growing pains. So this part of the reason for the entry into the war against Spain was this sense of great national pride, which they felt had been injured by the blowing up of the Maine in 1898. Remember that episode in which the American warship, for some reason, there had been tensions, there had been saber rattling between the U.S. from 1895 when the Cuban Revolution broke out, that in 1898, just as things seemed to be calming down between Spain and the Americans, for some strange reason, the government ordered the USS Maine on a billed as a friendly visit to Havana, Cuba. Well, Mark Hanna, we've talked about Mark Hanna, said, my God, why would you send a ship in the midst of these hostilities between us and Spain? Why would you send a warship to Havana, Cuba? That's like waving a lighted match in an oil drum just for fun. And what happens in 1898 is that there is a mysterious explosion. The Maine is blown up, and 250 good Americans are lost. And while there is no evidence that Spain committed the dastardly deed, in fact, the evidence suggests that Spain would not have done it, because Spain was looking for a way to avoid war with the U.S. And in fact, had kowtowed to several of McKinley's, he called them requests, they were actually demands. They were really not anxious to get into a war with the U.S. No one really ever knows who destroyed the Maine. There are a number of theories. One was that it was Cuban loyalists, Spaniards who owned land in Cuba who did not want, who wanted to make sure that war broke out between the U.S. and Spain. Because as things were getting better, they didn't want to see that happen. They wanted to see a war, because if a war broke out, then the U.S. Would have to, Spain would have to protect their interests against the U.S., who was moving now to support the Cuban revolutionaries for democracy. On the other hand, the Cuban revolutionaries didn't want to see a peace between Spain and America either. They knew if war broke out, the U.S. would come in and be on their side. Then there is this whole notion that William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper publisher, sent private agents down there and blew up the warship so he could sell more newspapers. After the war, the war broke out, he has this big headline, now how do you like my little war? What does that mean? But least of all, it was Spain. Spain really did not seem like it was interested in a war. But once the Maine is destroyed, American national pride demands restitution. As the saying went, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. And after that, it didn't matter whether Spain had done it. Now, Spain was going to get whipped as a result of it. And so you have the Spanish-American War in 1898. It's called the Splendid Little War. It doesn't last long. It lasts about 4 months. Starts in April, is over in time for summer vacation in August. It's not a war of great battles. I mean, basically, Roosevelt stole all the attention as he resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to become Lieutenant Colonel and lead troops up San Juan Hill, the Rough Riders. And the only other incident, Dewey, very efficiently sank the Spanish fleet, in the Philippines. Well, there was only one other incident that really, I should mention that Guam was a possession of Spain during the war. Nobody told the Spanish garrisons on Guam that there was a state of war between the U.S. and Spain. As the American ships approached Guam, the Spanish rushed out to give the Americans a 21-gun salute out of respect for this foreign country. And as they came out and gave the Americans a 21-gun salute, the Americans responded by bombing the hell out of Guam. One of those little side notes in history. But the upshot of the Splendid Little War is how America was viewed by foreign powers. The defeat of Spain, which really hadn't been a power since it was defeated by the Spanish Armada in 1588. But the defeat of Spain, now, it was hailed as a major victory by European countries, especially England, who now welcomed America into the community of world powerdom. America, England recognized, seemed now to be willing to accept the fact that there was an end to this notion of physical isolation that America had prided itself on for centuries, of being so far removed from the rest of the world that what happened in the rest of the world didn't concern America. The Spanish-American War ended that. Roosevelt understood that when he takes over as president, that the world had in many ways shrunk. You could travel around the world in less than a month. And remarkable. So the world had shrunk. That was the end to this sense of physical isolation. They couldn't simply entertain that. At least those forward-looking individuals like Roosevelt. So you had to be a part of the world. And we'll see Roosevelt will take his place even more in a moment. And then you had the need for surplus markets, the teachings of A.T. Mahan, and this notion of the new imperialism. Between the 1880s and the first part of the 20th century, there was a period of colonization in the world. European countries and Asian countries were engaged in a frantic grab for overseas possessions. But these overseas possessions were clearly in response to what A.T. Mahan had been talking about. All these countries wanted to become major powers. To become a major power, you had, the belief was, these overseas possessions. Now, often, this imperialism was masked by something called the white man's burden. That, to disguise their business and military and national interests, they would often cloak national interests in terms like it was the duty of advanced countries to spread civilization to the less fortunate non-white populations of the world. Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden, the poem. Somebody else had a response to Kipling's poem after America had annexed the Philippines. He said, well, now, Rudyard, now that we've taken up the ebony and brown, now will you please tell us how we can now put it down? Because the burden became heavy, especially with the revolution in the Philippines. Let's look at the Philippines just for a second because it brings together all of these factors. And actually, I can give you one speech, sort of, that will show you the intersection of all these factors by 1899 and 1900. And that is the speech that William McKinley gave in church one Sunday. This was after the Americans had annexed the Philippines. There was a public outcry because the Filipinos had believed that they had assisted the Americans in defeating the Spanish. And that in return, as they had done in Cuba, the Cubans would be freed and would have independence. And certainly so would the Filipinos. But for some reason, while the Cubans are given their independence, the Filipinos are annexed. They can't understand this, and in fact, they will respond against the country they had just helped by a revolution that will cost the Americans 4 times as many men to put down as it did to defeat the Spanish. They will resort to many of the same barbaric practices and against the Filipinos as they had criticized the tactics of the Spanish used against the Cuban freedom fighters. Then why would they? Well, William McKinley told his Methodist brethren one Sunday when they asked him. He said, the truth is, I didn't want the Philippines. And when they came to us, as if a gift from the gods, I didn't know what to do with them. I sought counsel from all sides, Democrats as well as Republicans, but got no advice. Night after night, I walked the floor of the White House. And then, late one night, it came to me. I don't know exactly how it came to me, but it came to me this way. That we could not give them back to Spain. That would be dishonorable. That we could not turn them over to the French and the Germans, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad business and discreditable. That we could not leave them to themselves. For soon, anarchy and misrule, worse than that under Spain, would surely return. That there was nothing left for us to do as brothers in Christ, but to take them and civilize them and do the very best we could by them and take them all. And I went to sleep. And I slept soundly. That was McKinley's explanation of how they came to annex the Philippines. Business comes in. The Philippines, the location of the Philippines was remarkable. If Hawaii was strategic, the location of the Philippines was even more strategic. It would put the U.S. within distance of half the world in times of war, or we talked about our commercial rivals in the Orient. That was a bustling, that was a spirited commercial competition in the Orient and the Pacific Rim, as we call it today. And the U.S., with its need for surplus markets, had to be involved in that and needed the Philippines to facilitate that national objective. We see that in this. The notion of duty, new imperialism, that these people were uncivilized and that the Americans somehow would pass on their civilization to these people, which is just an excuse, that this was destiny, dollars, duties, and destiny, that the Americans were destined to expand there. It was destiny and duty. And then there was honor. Nationalism, you couldn't turn them back to Spain. All these factors, the need for surplus markets, the end of physical isolation, the teachings of A.T. Mahan, American nationalism, and the new imperialism all came together, both in the Spanish-American War. It was America's coming out party as a world power. It was America's first realization of its own needs in terms of foreign policy as a nation. Let me say this before we talk about foreign policy. I am one that does not believe that foreign policy is ever determined by morality. In general, I don't think people, well, let me put it this way. People rarely do things out of pure altruism and morality and selflessness. People do things out of self-interest. Countries do things out of self-interest. Foreign policies of countries, no matter what they tell you, are rooted, whether it's America or Germany or anybody else, they are rooted in policies that serve and promote the national needs of their countries. That is what foreign policies are designed to do. In some way, they promote the needs, whether it's security, whether it's economics, but rarely does it have anything to do with morality. Although morality will maybe used to make foreign policy more palatable. But foreign policy is essentially a function of self-interest. And we won't talk about foreign policy in moralistic terms. I don't judge foreign policy that way. I simply look at what the country's goals are and how they attempt to achieve them. And certainly by the end of the 19th century, America's objectives are clear. America's foreign policy must be rooted somehow in protecting American economic interests abroad. The establishment of the open door policy, which is the formalization, the formal enunciation of a foreign policy for America, is rooted in economics. Is rooted in those factors that I just mentioned. It's rooted in McKinley's speech. America is well served by a Secretary of State who understands everything I have just mentioned. He is a skillful, he is a man of great foresight in understanding what America needs and how to achieve those objectives. That man is Secretary of State John Hay. John Hay understands how the world has changed and what America must do to protect its interests abroad. He will single-handedly, virtually shape American foreign policy, as we will see the next time we meet.